Okay, I think we're going to get started. Hopefully you can all see and hear me. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Opening of the House. Before we get into our main programming, we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land. Okay, so welcome to Opening of the House. It's great to have you all here. This is the annual Kickstarter event and the first event of the year for the Heart House Debating Club. My name is Sarah, and I will be the president of the club for this year. So a couple of things are going to happen tonight. Obviously, the main event is a show debate from 4 of some of our club's top debaters. But before that, I'm going to get into a little bit of what we do at the Heart House Debating Club, who we are, how you can join us, how you can meet with us, all of that good stuff. So the Heart House Debating Club is the premier debating club at the University of Toronto. And debate, as you can probably imagine, is the act of formal argumentation where you're given topics on literally anything related to, sports, to politics, to international relations, to social justice. And you're taught and expected to kind of make arguments for and against any of the topics that you're given. So that's kind of what you're expected to do at meetings and within the club in general. We attract a lot of new members every year of multiple skill levels. So whether you did a lot of debate in high school or whether you're kind of just here because you had like a free Wednesday afternoon, we're really, really excited to welcome you here. One of the probably most important parts of debate is also the community that it boasts within the club. So it's very, very easy within debate to meet a huge community of really nice, like rewarding, fulfilling people as well, especially given that the Heart House Debating Club sends members to tournaments every year. So back in pre-COVID times, we would send members everywhere from like Thailand to South Korea to Oxford and Cambridge universities, and of course, all over the United States and Canada for very, very cheap. But obviously, we are still in a pandemic, so all tournaments are online this year. And all that means is that we just have more of an opportunity to send more and more club members to tournaments around the world as well. Again, for very cheap, like the average cost of an online tournament is probably like $5 or something. So there's a lot of opportunities, whether you just want to hang out with us during meetings or whether you want to compete at tournaments. There's a lot of opportunities to do all of that as well. So our meetings are going to be online this year. So our meetings will be held Tuesdays from 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and Thursdays from 4 to 6 p.m. as well. And those will be on a Discord server, the link which I will post after the show debate as well. So stick around for that. And of course, it will be emailed out and posted on the Facebook event as well. Oh, I think it stopped sharing. Okay, we're good. So in terms of upcoming events, if you're excited to get involved, we have a number of opening events that are coming up very, very soon. So the first one is our Novice Trading Day. And this event is happening this Saturday. Again, we welcome novices or first-year debaters of all skill levels. You'll get to meet upper years, learn a lot about the club, learn about the style of debate we'll be doing as well. And you'll get the chance to participate in 2 kind of practice debates where you'll get to test out debate and see if it's good for you as well. So if you want to sign up for that, I will also be posting the sign up link for that after the show debate as well. Whether or not you're able to attend Novice Trading Day, everyone is invited to our first weekly meetings. So as mentioned, they will be on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Next Tuesday, September 21st from 7 to 9, and next Thursday, September 23rd from 4 to 6 on Discord. And finally, the first tournament of the year, which we want to send every single novice who is interested in going, is the Central Novice Debating Tournament. This will be happening on October 2nd to 3rd. It is honestly one of the most fun tournaments that we send members to every year. It was one of my favorite weekends in first year. So definitely when the form opens for that, see if you're interested and sign up. But regardless, give debate a try, and we hope to see you at some or all of these events. So if you're interested in learning more about the club and kind of just sticking around for updates and stuff like that, there are a lot of places that you can get updates from as well. So the first one is the Facebook page, which is the Heart House Debating Club on Facebook. This page is kind of just where we post a lot of updates from tournaments. We celebrate all our members, all of that stuff. More relevant if you're a club member is the Heart House Debating Club members Facebook group, which is where we post all announcements, all like links to sign up for tournaments if you're interested. Everything kind of relevant for members is in this group. Obviously though, Facebook is like kind of a boomer social media platform. So we also, again, have our Discord server as well, where all like kind of announcements and everything that's posted in the Facebook group will be posted here as well. So there are a lot of opportunities to kind of join the club and stay up to date and get involved at any point in the year that you'd like. And finally, we just launched our Instagram as well, and we have a lot of fun stuff planned for our Instagram, including like highlighting our members, including, you know, publishing terminology related to debate in general, and just a lot of like fun graphics and announcements as well. So stay tuned on our Instagram. We have a lot of really fun stuff coming up for that. Okay, if you guys have any questions, you can ask them now. I think there was one question that Eric answered, which I will just say out loud in case people haven't seen it. If you have class during one of the meeting times, that is all good. You definitely don't have to attend both meetings. You can skip a week of meetings if you want as well. You can come to one, you can come to both. It's truly whatever you want and according to your schedule. They are there every week. Feel free to just show up whenever you want and whenever you have the ability to. Both will be on Discord, etc. Okay, are there any other questions before we get into the debate? And there will also be another opportunity to ask questions at the end if you have any. Okay, so someone asked if there's any form we must fill out to become members of the club. No, there's no form or no membership or anything like that. If you want to join the club, literally just show up to any of these events, whether that's Novice Trading Day, whether that's any of these 2 weekly meetings. There's no like formal sign up or membership process for anything like that. In terms of in-person opportunities, we are very much just kind of like playing this pandemic by ear. So right now we're just still hosting meetings online, just in the interest of safety of club members and all of that stuff. That being said, when it becomes available for us to host in-person meetings, we will jump on the chance to do that. And we also want a chance to host in-person socials as well. Of course, following proper COVID guidelines, i.e. meeting in a park, which is a social happening next Saturday in our members group, etc. So in-person opportunities will happen as soon as it becomes more safe too. There is no membership fee. The question was, is there a membership fee? There is no membership fee to join the club. Again, no fee, no application process. All you kind of need to do is show up to like any events that you want. That being said, if you want to go to a tournament, there is a small fee for attending one. Again, it is just $5 for any online tournament that you attend. So for example, if you sign up for the Central Novice Tournament, you will need to pay $5 to do that. What styles of debate do you do? That's a great question. So there are 2 major styles that we do. I won't get too into them just yet because one I will introduce for the show debate today and the other one will be introduced on Saturday. So the first and most common style is a style called British Parliamentary, which basically involves 8 speakers in a round. So 4 teams of 2 teams supporting the topic and 2 teams against the topic. Again, we'll go a lot more in depth into this style on Saturday and during our weekly meetings as well. The other style that we do, which you'll see tonight, which I'll explain in a second, is Canadian parliamentary format, which is much simpler. You just have 2 speakers supporting the topic, 2 speakers against the topic. For folks who aren't familiar with styles of debate just yet, these are just like, yeah, kind of self-explanatory, but just different formats in which people debate. So in which people can explain like why they're for a topic or why they're against a topic, etc. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Okay, great. Then I think we are good to jump into the show debate. So for the debate, we have, again, a government team and an opposition team. So the 2 speakers on government will be arguing in favor of the topic, so like agreeing with the topic, and the 2 speakers on opposition will be arguing against the topic. The way in which this format will kind of work, and if this doesn't make sense, it will become so much clearer during the round, so don't worry about it, is that we will kind of alternate between 2 teams. So Tanvir will go up, give his speech, followed by Eric from the opposition team, who will give his speech, followed by Simran from the government team, who will give her speech, followed by James from the opposition team, who will give their speech. So we will essentially just alternate between the 2 teams so that everyone can kind of have their piece. That is kind of it in terms of the format of the debate. We'll be debating the motion, if you haven't already seen, assuming it was possible to accurately measure an individual's empathy, this House would only allow individuals with high levels of empathy for people beyond their immediate circles to vote in elections. So one cool part of this debate, which isn't super common with most debates that we do, is that you folks in the audience are going to get to decide who wins and who loses the debate. Very exciting. So the way in which this will work is that we'll have two polls, one before the debate, so like basically right now, and one afterwards. So when the poll appears on the screen, it will ask you, what side of the motion do you agree with? Do you agree that only individuals with high levels of empathy for people beyond their immediate circles should vote in elections, or do you not agree with that? So take a second, think about the topic, think about which side you agree with as soon as the poll shows up. I don't know if it's showing up yet. I think it should be showing up soon. Jillian, are you creating the poll or?
It's live. We have about 73% of people who have weighed in.
Awesome. I just can't see that on my end, but all good. Okay, we'll give everyone about 30 seconds.
Wonderful. And the results are shared. So we have 16% in favor of side government, 68% in favor of side opposition, and 16% unsure.
Nice. Okay, so as implied, we'll now have the show debate, and then we will poll you folks again to see which side you agreed with more based on the round. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, and if there are no other questions from anyone, we can get started with the round. So I call upon the first speaker from side proposition or side government, Tanvir, to open the debate for their side. Hear, hear.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tanvir. I'll count down to my speech. My pronouns are they and he. And for POIs, please just open your screen, open your video and raise hands. All right, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The principle of democracy is that each individual has an equal say in their nation's politics. The problem with this is that each individual getting a vote is a poor proxy for that political engagement that it seeks to create, which is what the opposition has to defend. On the government side, you end up giving a smaller amount of individuals who happen to be empathic much more amounts of votes, much more amount of say, which results in a higher quality of political engagement that beats the Trumpian post-truth bullshit that we experience right now. First, some clarity for this debate. I think the government side has the fiat to say that this vote will pass the Congress or whatever, so don't argue riots or divisiveness. Secondly, we think that the immediate circle is your friends, family, your coworkers, probably not your neighbors because you often vote against them because you haven't met them or you don't care. A high level of empathy is probably that you're able to empathize with someone enough so that you care enough about their decision, about a decision that you make that may affect them. So you still might vote to remove affordable housing because you need something else really, really bad, but you will to some extent understand the pain that you're causing to these individuals by removing affordable housing. This does two things. First, you don't homogenize all policy in the country, but also on a secondary layer, you don't blindly vote against people just because you don't know them or you don't care about them, because there is a deep personal value to you because you care, you have empathy for these individuals and you might be hurt personally. We think for election, it might be all elections like national elections where you'd measure someone's empathy in Toronto against someone's in Vancouver, or if it's like a local, it'd be like the Saga versus GTA. Great. Before moving on, any clarifications? Okay, moving on. Why do, first thing I'm going to talk about is that why do empathetic people make good decisions and for every political spectrum, and who are these empathetic people and how do their brains work. We think the best case for politics is that we're supposed to make sure that we create policy that benefit the maximum amount of people, and anything that puts voters more in tune with or makes them care about their fellow citizens serves that purpose. We think empathy by definition makes individuals more sensitive to the condition of other people, and thus you're more likely to not otherize people just based on a whim, because it's literally antithetical to your personality. Politics thus becomes less populism-y because people can't incite you against other people just by saying that they are bad, they are taking away your things, because you care about other people and you're more likely to go and dig into what makes it so that these people are taking away your own rights, and probably find otherwise as your populism politician told you to. But the second thing is that you don't make this decision slightly because you are empathetic and you think that causing hurt to other people might also cause hurt to yourself on an emotional level. Yes, we understand that there's probably going to be some trade-off because progressives and liberals maybe do have more empathy on their but we think that it's all okay to make this trade-off, because look, people who are not empathetic are probably only making decisions that benefit small groups of people. The problem with this is that it is the first priority because the problem with this is that if it is the first priority of these people to make a decision that is best for the people who are most proximal to them, like their friends and family, it is not a viable good thing for the entirety of the country. Why is this true? It's true because these people are very likely to go for policies that offer the path of least resistance. So you might take away resources from someone else and give it to yourself and not care about what happens to the other people. What this all means is that you're creating policies that are not the best possible solutions, just the easiest possible solutions. And the harms from this are very clear. You incite populism, you make worse policies because of two reasons too. First is as politicians don't have to care enough about giving enough meat to the policies to make them better policies. But on a secondary layer, people don't have to care about other people, and people don't care about other people and just vote for the policies that they think will win. On opposition side, all of these harms become very stark. On our side of the house, you ameliorate them because you make people who care vote. POI.
So by this logic that people should always vote in ways that help other people and understand the impact of their policies, would you also strip voting rights from people who have low levels of education or who do not understand policies as much?
Yeah, yes. Why is it okay to limit the amount of people to this political change? And I think the reason why I said yes is because a lot of our benefits that will come about in a second. But this is, let's get into that. The reason I say yes is this. We think that what I said 2 seconds ago is that politicians and people don't have a reason to make their policies good enough or have a reason to educate people enough so that they care about other people. What this means is that Trump can go on and not care about putting up policies that help other people in the city, in the United States, as long as the Bible Belt votes for him. But on our side of the house, you'd probably go around to making those uneducated people educated and making them care about policies, making them care about other people so that they have the ability to vote and can make you like president of the United States. So on their side, you don't have an incentive to make these people educated. On our side, you do have an incentive to make them educated. We think that a lot of benefits come about from our side of the house other than what we just talked about, right? The first is that poor people disproportionately don't come out and vote on their side of the house because number one, they think that the system is not for them, and they will always get like shafted by the system. But on our side of the house, what you have is you cut out a portion of the population who would probably just vote for themselves, rich white individuals who only care about their own bottom line, about making their own businesses grow bigger and not caring about the rest of the country. We think that the moment these people are able to vote less, it means that the poor people that government themselves care about have each of their votes way more, which means that less rich white people voting who don't care about other people probably means that if a poor person is able to vote, their vote accounts for more. All of which means that poor people will have relatively more power in each vote. Lastly, we think people with empathy are able to generalize the views of their community better and also understand their communities and other communities in the country better. And when they go on television and when they go on their like town hall, they're able to speak better to what their own community needs. What that all translates to is that people who are able to vote are able to more accurately talk about the needs of their own communities, which means that you are able to better characterize and understand and like show on a national or a local level what your community stands for, which makes your community feel more included in politics, which increases political engagement in your community, which is good because democracy is better for the more amount of people that engage in democracy. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister very much for their speech and invite up the leader of the opposition to open up the case for their side. Hear, hear.
Hello, my name is Eric, and I use he or they pronouns. I'll be starting in just 1 second. I'm going to talk about two key ideas in this speech. Firstly, why people have an absolute right to vote, irrespective of their empathy. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the negative outcomes of this policy in terms of cutting out large groups of voters. Before that, I want to tackle one central idea that we got from the government case, which is that when you enact this policy, it defeats populism because only empathetic people are voting. I want to respond to this in two ways. The first is that I think it's a huge oversimplification of populism to suggest that the problem is a lack of empathy. In a lot of cases, the problem is not a lack of empathy, which is to say that people within these groups often have empathy, but the problem is that that empathy is extended only to certain groups, but not to other groups. People who are part of populist movements often do extend empathy, often to the working class, often to the rural poor, often to people who look similar to them, and often to people who they feel are politically excluded, but not to people of color or immigrants or refugees. The problem isn't a lack of empathy, but it's who that empathy is directed to. It is deeply unclear to me that this type of empathy test would actually solve for those problems when there are much larger issues like misinformation, structural inequality, political exclusion, that all influence populism. But secondly, and more importantly, which is that even if it's true that this empathy test actually weeds out all populist voters, I think this is a terrible method of dealing with populism and racism. Because I want to remind everyone, these are literally the people who voted in racist politicians and started an insurrection in the Capitol because they felt that they were being excluded from the mainstream political system. And that was when they literally did have the right to vote. Government is literally imagining a world in which they think they can strip people of their voting rights and populism disappears. That's not the world in which we live, and it's unlikely that that's going to be a meaningful solution to populism. Let's get into the first argument. Why do people have an absolute right to vote, irrespective of their empathy levels? The key question that this argument seeks to answer is, what is the basis behind voting rights? And the first thing I want to do is challenge the premise from government that the purpose of voting is to develop the most empathetic policy, or to make sure we have the most informed policy possible. There are intuitive reasons why this is false and not the goal of democracy. But the thing that I want to highlight is that if it were true that the actual purpose of democracy is to come to the most objectively empathetic or objectively informed policy possible, then it's deeply unclear to me why we would even have any sort of a voting system if we lived in a world with a perfect empathy test. Because the logical conclusion of the government case is we should just have a technocratic system where we just pick like the 10 most empathetic people and have them decide everything. The fact that government isn't arguing for this probably suggests that there is something more important than empathy, that empathy itself is not the basis of democracy, and that there are values that supersede empathy in deciding what is important. Instead, on opposition, we argue that there are two distinct reasons that it is necessary to have free and fair voting rights in a democratic system, both of which are entirely unrelated to empathy. What are those reasons? Firstly, we have voting rights to offer representation, which helps restrain powerful and coercive systems. The reality is, all of us live inside a state system. This is a system that none of us chose to live in. States are institutions that often have a monopoly on violence, where the state commands obligations of citizens such as paying taxes, where we are governed by people who aren't necessarily more knowledgeable or more qualified than us, and we do not choose to exist in this system. We do not choose the way that this world is organized into states. The state is therefore a powerful and coercive actor. The only way that such a system can be justified is if every citizen who lives within a state, who has to follow its rules, has a vote, has a form of representation, has an ability to control the state systems around them and influence them by voicing their preferences. To deny a person representation within a state system that they are coerced into is itself a form of subjugation. That's why it's illegitimate to strip any person of voting rights, irrespective of things like empathy or any other personality traits. To illustrate this, think about why it's illegitimate to strip prisoners of voting rights, because these people are quite literally under the thumb of the state, and to deny them the ability to represent themselves and have the ability to influence how the state works is illegitimate. It's genuinely baffling that government is also fine with doing things like restricting voting for people who don't have a lot of education. But secondly, the other reason why we have voting rights, and this is really important, is that policies are fundamentally subjective. The implicit assumption of the government case is that they know what a good decision is, that a good vote is an empathetic one. We do not believe democracy works this way. Democracy is not about deciding for people what a good vote is, and then building up your political system in a way that engineers the votes that you've decided are good. The purpose of democracy is to present a choice to people and allow them to determine what is a good choice in and of itself. The reason for this is quite clear, because there often is not an objective answer to policy decisions. There is no objective answer to whether or not more free trade or more protectionism is always good for the average voter in all cases. There isn't an objective answer as to whether or not UBI is objectively better than rent assistance for every voter. It's important for people to be able to vote based on what makes their life personally better in order to decide policy, because policy is often fundamentally subjective. That's critical because I think it's entirely legitimate for people to vote based on their own self-interest or self-preservation. If you're a working class worker, if you're a working class individual employed at a factory, you probably have a valid opinion on whether or not free trade is good for you in your personal life, regardless of how empathetic you are. If you're a queer voter, you probably have a valid opinion on things like equal access to medical care, regardless of how empathetic you are, and you deserve to be able to vote in that, irrespective of whether you know the intricacies of how every policy affects every other person. The important thing is you are entitled to vote on the basis of self-interest, irrespective of how it affects others, because the purpose of voting is not tied to empathy at all. It has nothing to do with how empathetic you are, but has everything to do with the fact that you exist in a coercive system, the fact that you deserve to be able to represent yourself, and that is something that people deserve as an inherent right. I'll take a question from government if they have one.
If someone assaults you, do you want them put in prison or not?
So this is an irrelevant question to the debate because that is a violation of another person's basic rights. Insofar as these are votes that actually matter to people because everyone equally exists in a coercive system, it's just denying anyone's voting rights is a fundamental violation of that right. So in terms of the second argument, the negative effects of this policy in cutting out certain groups of voters. The intuition behind this argument is quite simple, which is that we would not allow any sort of policy that excludes voters based on any sort of trait influenced by environmental factors or is outside of that person's control, which is to say we would never take away someone's vote based on income level, education, race, gender, etc., because that itself would be harmful and discriminatory. This is important for empathy because we often at best cannot say for certain where empathy comes from or how it is shaped. It is extremely difficult to determine your own empathy level or meaningfully change it. That's because empathy possibly comes from things like genetic factors. It possibly comes from things that are learned from your environment at schools, in your community. It possibly comes from family structures and values or experiences that have happened to you. This means that empathy is something that is often well outside of your control and happens well before you become a voting age. That means that people often meaningfully cannot determine their own empathy or change it. You are effectively excluding people based on factors they cannot control and do not have meaningful self-determination over. At the end of this debate, the most critical argument is that you have a right to vote, irrespective of empathy. Voting is not a privilege, it's a right that you have. That's why you cannot remove it from people. We oppose.
Okay, I'd like to thank the first opposition speaker very much for their speech and invite up the second proposition speaker to extend the debate for their side. Hear, hear.
Hi everyone, I'm Simran. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to be the second speaker on the government team who supports the motion. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it's very interesting that opposition runs a case talking about the lovely structure of democracy and the ways in which democracy protects people without recognizing the role that self-interest has played in eroding these democratic systems and in fact making them less democratic overall, even though people have the right to vote. The ways in which power structures have become corrupt over time because populism and politicians are able to fearmonger their population, make it so collective action cannot happen when people want to vote for policies that help their neighbor, but instead are voting for policies in their own self-interest because they're socialized into a society where we are taught that we only should be looking out for ourselves. the reason why we propose this motion on the table today is because, one, we believe that the kind of society we want to foster is one of empathy, where we put this on the forefront as something we value in a system. Our system today values things like individualism, right? So this is the kind of way we're socialized in society. In order to take you into the government world, you have to really imagine what this kind of world would look like in a world where we place empathy at the forefront of decision-making. A lot of the things that Eric points out as reasons why the system wouldn't work or why the system would exclude people of color and whatnot are things that would not necessarily exist in the system for a few reasons. So first of all, regarding can empathy be taught to people? We think that this is a value that is socialized into people in a society. We do not necessarily exist in a society today where we socialize people towards empathy. We socialize people towards a system of you are looking out for yourself and your own self-interest. In a society where only the most highly empathetic people from outside their own circles were able to vote, this would be a value that we socialize into society. And we think empathy is it's very hard to assert whether or not it's caused by genetic factors or whatnot. We think by and large, most people can learn to be empathetic if they're raised in a society that fosters empathy. So one, we don't think empathy is this exclusionary trait where it's super wholly concentrated and people cannot learn to be empathetic. We think this creates a more empathetic society, and people, regardless of class, regardless of race, can be empathetic. Secondly, what kind of policies does this create? This doesn't necessarily mean you can't vote for a policy that you yourself believe in. It just simply has to be a policy in which other people are not actively screwed over by it, right? The bar is not that complicated, right? If I'm a working class person and I have reasons for why I might not want some tax policy, as long as I'm empathetic and I understand the types of people who will be hurt by these types of policies, and I understand the effects of these policies, which once again, we don't think is a super high bar to pass, we think that you can still vote however you want. And lastly, politicians now have an incentive when they're going around campaigning to not focus on individual identity politics, right? Not focus on things like fear mongering, things like populism. We think populism is caused by the fact that politicians can take advantage of the fact that people are looking out for their self-interest, because it's a lot easier for politicians to simply fearmonger and pick an isolated group of people, oftentimes minorities, and say they are the reason for your problems, rather than actually provide robust policy when looking at the ways the policies affect other people within their country. We think that the reason why politics has come down to this kind of this kind of theater where people are memeing at each other, people are arguing very intensely, is because of the fact they know that it's easier to fearmonger, it's easier to create this sort of violent political atmosphere because people aren't looking out for each other. So we think that in order to step into the world of government, you have to be able to conceptualize the kind of world that we are proposing, where empathy is at the forefront of the table. This is a massive change from how our political world looks like today. Well, as we said, we think this changed the way politicians campaign. This changes the rhetoric around politics. This changes the way that education is delivered. This changes the way policies are delivered. So we think it's very narrow-minded of opposition to come up here and say, if we take our current world today, this will not work, right? We think we need to imagine what this kind of world would look like where we put empathy at the forefront. So that's essentially on the idea of how this will play out. But in terms of, is this justified principally, right, in a society, right? Do we have the right to restrict the votes for a certain amount of people given the principles of democracy? We say yes, for two main reasons. First of all, a principle justification. So why do people enter a society? People enter a society not because they want lovely democracy. People enter a society because they don't want to actively get screwed over by their neighbor. They don't want to exist in a dog eats dog world, right? This is the reason why people enter society and enter social systems. So why then is it principally aligned for these people who have empathy to be the types of people that are selected to represent their groups when they're making decisions? Because we think these are the types of people who are going to come up with policies that are the best for society. We haven't heard real reasons as into why the policies they'll have will actively not hurt other people, right? Because even though some people are not voting, that doesn't mean they're actively being harmed by people who are empathetic who are voting now, right? We think this is a simple point of weighing, right? You have people who are self-interested who are voting who might screw over empathetic people. You have empathetic people who are voting who probably aren't going to be screwing over the people who are now non-voter people in the population, right? Simply because the very definition that we're working with in this motion are people who are empathetic outside of their own circles, outside their own connections. So therefore, we think it's logical to extend this to say that they're empathetic to people who don't necessarily exist within their existing social circles. So these empathetic people are unlikely to come up with policies that actually hurt people who are non-voters. So non-voters' opinions may not be represented, but they're not going to be actively harmed by pretty much any kind of policies that these empathetic people would vote for, because once again, that is like the criteria of empathy itself. Conversely, if you live in a society where you allow anyone to vote, right, you are more likely to get empathetic people who are now unable to kind of have the policies that they want passed. You get a more violent political atmosphere. You have people being actively harmed. So if we're going on the idea of like, is this principally justified? We think that the reason why we exist in society is so we can actively trust the people around us, not enter these sort of collection action dilemmas where now we are forced to be thinking individualistically because we know we cannot rely on other people. We think this is the sort of thing that erodes a society. We think this is the sort of thing that allows power to be concentrated at the top because people are voting in their self-interest. People are able to create this violent political atmosphere where they try and get their interests promoted, where the rich give exorbitant amounts of money to politicians to get their interests represented only for themselves. We think this is the sort of thing that starts to erode political systems over time. So in terms of our principal justification, we think it's perfectly fine if we want to limit the amount of people who can vote, insofar as these are the types of people who are able to uphold the societal structures rather than erode and corrupt them over time. If we were to give an example of this, right, when rich people give a lot of money to politicians to have their issues represented, this means that even though poor people and working class people have the ability to vote, their policy issues may not be represented as much because politicians now have this incentive to cater towards a powerful group of people, right? If anything, we've used this motion as an equalizer, right? Where right now there are power imbalances within society between people who are not empathetic, but often hold a lot of power in society, and between people who do not have a lot of power in society, but who have a lot of empathy. So in conclusion, I've done three things. Firstly, I've shown you that pretty much anyone can be empathetic in this theoretical society. We've shown you that it's a trait that can be learned. It's a trait that can be fostered. So this trait is not exclusionary. I've also told you about what kind of policies we can get into society, and I've told you how politics can change. Lastly, I've given you a principal justification for why this is all right to do for society as a whole, and we're not like breaking any like moral codes or moral norms. We're simply correcting a harm that exists in society. For these reasons, vote government.
Okay, I'd like to thank that speaker very much for their speech and invite up the second speaker of opposition to continue the case for their side.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, you're good.
Side government makes one massive assumption all throughout their case, which is that empathetic people are somehow also free of things like racism, of misinformation, of bigotry, of being short-sighted, of being misinformed, etc. We don't get an explanation, despite Eric's protest, as to why it is the case that people who are more empathetic are also then naturally going to be much better voters, aside from a few assertions we get tossed here and there throughout both speeches. It is because of this fundamental flaw that side government not only fails to prove why this is justified, but also fails to prove why this will actually result in better policy. It's because we think this is both unjustified and abhorrent restriction of the rights that everyone deserves, but also likely to result in disastrous consequences that we have never been prouder to oppose. The first question I want to talk about is whether empathy is static, right? Because we hear a response from the second speaker on government, which is that, oh, but you can be socialized into it, is that there are other factors into it. This doesn't deal with the material we hear from Eric in the slightest. It just says that, oh, but you could be socialized into it. That's something possible in this new reimagined society. Even if it is possible that people can learn empathy to an extent, this doesn't negate the fact that Eric explains that it's very difficult. And a lot of your initial empathy often comes from factors that are beyond your control. That's to say that similarly, people can technically change their economic status. If you're poor, you technically could just stop being poor, but it's really, really difficult. And often there are many factors outside of your control that restrict you from being able to access that kind of social mobility. That's why we don't blame people for being poor or having low income. Instead, we seek to provide them with resources or opportunities that allow them to better their own lives, right? That's something that we think was really, really important. And that leads me to my second question I want to answer in this speech. Is this justified? Because firstly, we think that this is just discrimination among voters, which is something that we think is unjust in and of itself. To say that because you were born into a family, into a community or culture that said empathy was important and you weren't, therefore, one of you has the ability to represent yourself and the policy that affects you for the rest of your life, and the other one simply does not. No thank you to the POI. That's something that we think is unjust. But I also want to respond to the refutation we hear from Simran, which is that, oh, but people opted into society because it's better than the state of nature, right? Therefore, there's no such thing as kind of democratic rights. Here's why that's not true. And I want to refute this or rebut this with a thought experiment. Imagine someone had a gun to your head and said, you can either choose to get shot or you can give me all of your money. You'd probably give them all of your money because you likely don't want to die. But here's the thing. Even though you made a choice, that wasn't a meaningful choice because you're coerced into that position in the first place, because both of those things were terrible for you. We would never say that, oh, that person willingly gave away all their money, so it's technically not robbery. You would never say that. In the same case, the state of nature is terrible, but state subjugation is also something that's terrible. Thus, the issue of state subjugation and the need to resolve that issue still exists. And that's something that Eric answers exclusively in their speech when they talk about avoiding state subjugation by having some kind of mechanism to reflect your preferences onto the state that also has so many mechanisms of power over you, right? Then when Simran talks about the way up and the way up and saying, oh, but at least we have people who are making better policy decisions. Even if that's true, and I'm going to get into why that's not true, the issue is then it begs the question, why do we have democracy in the first place? As Eric points out, why not just have a technocracy? Why not just have a political system where you gather the 10 most empathetic people and have them make all of the decisions? The reasons why is a fundamental need to represent yourself, the fact that policy is inherently subjective, the fact that people are allowed to have selfish preferences and reflect that in the state and how they are governed. All of those things are still true, and that's why we still give people voting rights. So if they want to defend a world and just in which you restrict voting rights and justify and these people make better policy decisions, they also need to explain why they're willing to do away with democracy as a whole. Eric's argument still stands. We have fundamental freedoms and rights that ought to be respected, and to enact this policy, even if it had good outcomes, is something that cannot be accepted. Before I move on to my last theme, I'll take a POI from Simran.
The motion is empathy for people outside your social circles. Why would these people then be racist?
Yeah, I'm going to get into that in a second, right? So last question, will this policy actually result in better government policy? Or will this motion result in better government policy? So the first thing I want to point out is that being empathetic doesn't mean that you have a better or more informed vote, right? Even if you're empathetic, you're still susceptible to things like misinformation or a lack of information, right? That's to say that you can care, but you can be ignorant of what the best solution actually is, right? So a lot of people support rent control because it seems like a good way to make rent more affordable. Obviously, that's something that a lot of empathetic people would likely support, even if they can't afford rent. But rent control has actually increased rent prices because it pushes people to build new kinds of condos, like luxury condos, so they can escape low, forcibly low rent rates, and then they can charge more. It's actually made rent more expensive and housing less affordable. Same thing with the forced liberalization of economies. Many people think that, oh, more free trade means that your economy is going to develop. But it's actually hurt a lot of economies across the world. Just because you care doesn't mean you know what the best solution is. And it's very easy to be fooled into what the wrong solution is, given the nature of elections. Secondly, we also think that there's the inherent subjectiveness of policy that Eric talks about in their speech. That's to say that a lot of policy, it's unclear what truly is the right decision. So whether you're empathetic or not doesn't influence your ability to determine what the better policy would be, right? Government says, oh, but you're able to consider more people. You're not voting in a selfish way. So that's just going to be better. One, we think this is fine. Eric explains why being selfish is totally justified. But two, we'd say that the voting system already accounts for people being selfish. And that's why it aggregates preferences. It chooses the policies that benefits the most people. So it's fine to be selfish because everyone else is also being selfish. But the second thing I want to say under this theme is that being empathetic does not mean that you're unbigoted, classist. That does not mean that you're unbigoted or not classist or not scared, right? Eric told you that empathy can still exist in people who are racist. It's extended to different people. That's to say, I can be fear-mongered about immigrants coming in to ruin the country, and I have intense empathy towards people who were born in the country several generations ago. people within my state, people who look like me, who share my ideology. That is far beyond my immediate circle. And I have intense empathy for those people. I simply do not have empathy for the people coming into the country. So that's a populism, fear mongering, all of these things can still exist on their side of the house. But lastly, on consequences, I think that gets much worse because riots, divisiveness, these things become much more prone to happening when you have a large segment of the population that is actually being excluded and feels the intense political frustration of not being able to be represented for all of those reasons, because we think it's incredibly unjustified, but also because it'd be disastrous and consequences we're incredibly proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker very much for their speech and invite back up the first opposition speaker to close up the case for their side.
I'm going to structure this summary speech around the two strategical errors of government that lose them this debate. The first is that at no point in their speeches do they effectively and concretely demonstrate that the world meaningfully gets better. In the first minute of our first speech in opposition, we explained that this does not defeat populism in the way that government describes. They claim that voting based on empathy means that we get rid of populism, get rid of racist rhetoric, etc., and this changes campaigning meaningfully. This is unlikely to happen for all the reasons we pointed out that we're not responding to in their second speech. The fact that the problem isn't a sheer lack of empathy, but it's about who that empathy is extended to. And just look in real life, the fact that Fox News very constantly puts out messaging about terrorist attacks by people of color upon white individuals, the fact that Fox News constantly and other right-wing news networks appeal to emotion by digging at the fact that immigrants are going to be the ones who are supposedly taking jobs away from rural working class people, given that the first speaker in government defined empathy as caring for people beyond your social circle, plenty of people in popular circles care specifically about the rural poor, care specifically about farmers who have lost their jobs. That is uniquely something that means that is unlikely to solve just due to empathy under their side. But furthermore, even if they actually demonstrate that the world gets better, we've shown to you that that's irrelevant, because irrespective of whether the world gets better, you ought not restrict people's rights purely for the sake of consequences. To illustrate this, the world would maybe technically be better if I removed everyone's right to freedom of speech except like AOC. That doesn't mean it's a legitimate thing to do, because that is fundamentally against the ability of people to express themselves in meaningful ways in a coercive system. So even if government at their best were able to prove the world gets better, it's irrelevant because it's a consideration of whether or not you can violate people's rights in this particular instance. Let's talk more about whether the world gets better and why it's unlikely to. Because note, all throughout both of their speeches, neither government speaker could decide on a consistent answer about what empathy actually is and how they would meaningfully filter for it. Because notably, if you think back to the first speech that government gave, they made it sound like this will be a very, very stringent test, that they only want well-informed voters, people who understand how their policies affect others, people who understand the nuances and intricacies of how foreign policy will affect another person of a different race or ethnicity. But then the second speaker walked this back so much when they're questioned on and says, this will just be a super, super easy test to take. You just have to be a nicer person to other people around you. So that means government has to make a choice. They have to make a choice about whether this is a really, really difficult test that's very stringent, that tests how well you know about all intricacies of policy, in which case you are excluding tons of voters who do not know this stuff. Or it's the world that the second speaker lives in, where this is a very easy test. You just have to be slightly nicer to people, which a lot of people within populist movements are probably very capable of doing without changing their populist beliefs. That means either it's the case that you exclude tons of voters, which is illegitimate, or you have no effect on the world and you do not defeat populism at all. This is unlikely to change how politics works, and it's unlikely to do anything to defeat those terrible elements of populism that they describe. What they discuss in terms of the response to the argument about why you cannot violate people's rights is that the voting system in the status quo sucks, so we might as well do things that balance it out. Just because something is inconsistent in the status quo is not a reason to make it even less representative. Just because the criminal justice system can't catch all murderers doesn't mean we should give up on catching any of them. We ought to find a system that is as representative as possible. The way in which you do that is guarantee everyone a vote that they are entitled to. For all those reasons, we oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker very much for their speech and invite up the first proposition speaker to close up the debate for their side, as well as the round as a whole.
Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Opposition side claims that empathetic people can't, we ask opposition side that opposition side says that empathetic people can also be racist. Their answer to this is that no, but their circles are small and it's your empathy, but not all empathy. I genuinely don't understand what that means. The second point is that they say that technocracies are not something that people want and monarchies are not something that people want. I think a lot of people in America would probably prefer to stay in Singapore or Malaysia right now, rather than in their country where they can't do an abortion or like have socialized Medicare and they literally die because COVID has been killing them at unprecedented rates. The third thing is that they say that in their POI is that poor people might not have empathy. Do you exclude them? I think, first of all, that's an absurdly elitist notion to even harbor, because we think that it's the rich people who don't have empathy and they literally get rich by preying on other people in society and not giving them the means of production, not giving them enough remuneration for working for them and like making them rich. Lastly, they say that everyone else is being selfish. That's why it's okay for you to be selfish as well. We think a lot of people literally don't have their views in society represented because they are not selfish. It's because a lot of the liberal left in Canada, like the NDP, don't have a majority, and the Conservative Party is almost winning this election that is coming up. We think liberals are not being selfish by increasing taxes on themselves or by trying to establish Medicare in the entire United States. I think it's not okay to say that. Lastly, I never said that it'll be a hard test. I just said that people would have more incentives to make sure that policies have more meat and actually have more in them, to make sure that people empathize with their policies and vote for their policies, because people are now empathetic and don't just vote based on the headline that you have. Opening opposition has two basic claims. The first is everyone should have a vote unless it's violating someone else's right. The problem is voting doesn't only affect your own autonomy, it also affects the autonomy of everyone else around you. If you make an uninformed vote, you literally infringe on other people's autonomy. Case in point, Donald Trump became president because people voted for him, and Donald Trump took away the ability of trans people to enroll in the military, leading to these people not being able to serve their own country and feel that goodness within themselves of like being proper countrymen. We think that's an explicit harm on trans community that has happened because you've taken away their bodily autonomy, their autonomy to exist in society with your vote. We think opposition's argument is flipped on its head. The second thing is they say that empathy comes from family structures and values, and you are discriminating against people by not letting them go out in society and be empathetic like they are. This is literally the argument that Simran make when we said that empathy is socialized. It comes from value. So this is not a debate about how you are like excluding certain forms of empathy, because we're okay with conservative empathy, we're okay with liberal empathy, as long as you care about the other people enough that you look into what the policy is doing, that you look into how you're harming other people. We think that we will be letting them vote, and that's exactly why we make democracy, politics, and everything in between better. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that speech, and to all the speakers for a fantastic debate. So now is the time for you guys in the audience to decide who you think won. So Jillian will be posting up the same poll. Again, if you feel as though the government side was more convincing, vote government. If you feel like the opposition side is more convincing, vote opposition. All right, I'll give everyone like 30 more seconds. Okay, based on all the votes, it seems as though the winner of today's debate is side opposition. So great job to side opposition, and congrats to everyone for a really fantastic round. So to close off the event today, Jillian has already posted these links in the chat. So the Facebook group and Discord server where meetings will be held, where announcements will be made, all of that good stuff is at the top. So those first 2 links. And Novice Trading Day, which is our next event and happening this Saturday, can be signed up for at that Google form. I'm also going to post the Novice Trading Day Facebook event. So Novice Training Day event in the chat as well. Send that to everyone. So if you do have Facebook, please click going on that event as well, as that is where we will post all relevant details, information, all of that stuff. But if you are in the Facebook group and Discord, that should be all good on your end. Okay, does anybody have any last minute questions or anything people are still wondering before we let all of you go? Okay, then thank you very much for coming, everyone. We hope you enjoyed the debate and had a really good time. And we hope to see you all at Novice Trading Day this Saturday. Bye, everyone. Okay, to all speakers, would anyone like to withdraw their consent for this being published on YouTube? Okay, then I think we should all be good to go. Yeah, thank you so much for debating, everyone. Very sorry.